And you got to sell a lot of books, to make a house payment. And so it got to the place where I said, God, I know you've called me to do this, and I'm here, and I'm available to you, but I can't make a living at this. Most of the people that I work with, they could write their own books, but for some reason they call me. And I've discovered that if I go in and I'm a bit of a friend, and I'm a bit of a counselor sometimes, and a bit of a pastor, sometimes a little bit of a psychologist, and sometimes a little bit of a psychiatrist, if I do all those things well, I might have the opportunity to put the nouns and the verbs in the right order.
Welcome to Along the Way. I'm John Matarazzo, your host and fellow traveler. Thank you for joining me along my way as I try to become more like Jesus every day. I love talking with fascinating people and learning how God has met them along their way. In this episode of Along the Way, my journey connects me with best-selling author and my dad's old college roommate, Ken Abraham. 18 of his books have been on the New York Times bestsellers list, and as of this recording, he has written 95 books. Ken has authored books from some truly amazing people, from Buzz Aldrin to Bill Gaither, Jim Bakker to Joel Osteen, John Ashcroft to Joe Gibbs, and so many more. When I was in Nashville, I met up with Ken to find out how, as he likes to say, he gets the heart on paper. I'll get to the interview in just a moment, but I want to make sure that you know you can hear all my episodes, even the ones that you've missed, by visiting my website alongtheway.media, or simply subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, and you can keep in touch by emailing me at johnalongtheway@gmail.com. My social links and web address are in the show notes. I look forward to hearing from you. And now, here is my Along the Way conversation with Ken Abraham. Ken Abraham, thank you so much for being on Along the Way with me. It's going to be fun to hear about your journey of how God's been with you along your way.
Thank you, John. It's great to be with you. And yeah, it's been a journey for me. I can't believe I'm this old.
Well, I've known about you pretty much my whole life because you and my dad were friends in college.
That's
and
right.
From the stories that I've heard, you would come and crash on his couch in his dorm because you lived close to there.
I did.
Yeah. So before we get into that interview, can you just tell me a little bit about what life was like with my dad as a young guy?
That could be dangerous. I don't know. Well, actually, your dad was a great friend to me, and I was a relatively new Christian at that time.
Okay.
Really brand new. And, I grew up in a bar. My dad owned the bar.
Literally?
Literally owned the bar, the biggest bar in the county where your dad and I went to college. My dad owned the biggest bar in the county there. So that was my background. But I had just become a Christian, and so I was bumping into people like your dad and your Uncle Jim, and these guys were showing me a different kind of life than I knew, because most of the Christians that I had seen prior to that time were pretty boring.
Yeah.
They were just,
okay.
I hate to say it, but
that's real.
My images of Christianity were just like, okay, you're giving up everything. It's going to be dull. It's going to be dismal. You're going to be a sourpuss for the rest of your life, but you are going to go to heaven. In the end, you're going to go to heaven eventually. But when I met your brother, it was a whole different kind of thing. Your dad, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And your uncle as well. It was a whole different kind of thing. There was life there. Mm-hmm. And, and these guys were excited about serving the Lord, and they were excited about what God was going to do. And we were all young and silly and foolish and naive, and probably some of our aspirations and our dreams. But it was like, okay, God's going to use us to touch people's lives and maybe touch the world. And it's amazing to me looking back at that, how the Lord shaped some of those kind of things. And yeah, we had to learn a bunch, that's for sure. But your dad was very instrumental in my life, so thank you.
Yeah,
and
that's
your whole family,
yeah.
Really, your whole family has been a blessing to my family.
Yeah, I remember the first time that I actually met you. You were a guest on the His Place program.
Oh yeah.
I'm not exactly sure how my parents found out about it. Maybe we were watching the live episode and then we decided, hey, Ken Abraham's there right now. Let's go. Because the studio's only a few miles from where my parents live. I
remember sitting at the tables there.
We snuck on.
I do. Yeah.
My sister and I were like, Dad doesn't really know this guy. Like, it's kind of like a...
Dad
just says he knows him. Okay. And then... you see my dad in the distance, and you're like, Ralph!
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah,
so we were like,
yeah.
oh, this is cool. This is really
we
cool.
hadn't seen
Dad
each
knows
other
a
for quite a
celebrity.
while. Yeah, I'm not sure if I had moved to Nashville by that time or not.
I think you did.
Yeah, because for a while there, I was doing a lot with his place when I lived in the Pittsburgh area. I grew up in western Pennsylvania,
right.
a little town of Clymer, Pennsylvania, a couple hours, well, about an hour and a half out of Pittsburgh.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to get to his place quite often. And actually, when they first started the show, and I was always glad to be on the show and enjoyed the people there. But then when I moved to Nashville, I didn't get back that often.
Yeah.
So when I did, it was really special for me.
Yeah. So what was the thing that they were talking to you about on his place?
Oh, gee, I don't know. Probably the new book. Yeah, because at that time I had started writing. When I lived in Western Pennsylvania, I used to work with a band. The band was called the Watchmen, and a lot of people in Western Pennsylvania were familiar with us. We eventually changed the name to Abraham. Because we had all these Abrahams in the band, and some guy said, Watchmen, man, it sounds like four old guys singing around a piano. He said, you need to change it. You go, yeah, Abraham. He said, sounds Jewish. You got to do that. So we changed the name to Abraham. And anyhow, we continued to work more in a contemporary kind of Christian music, and we used to do a lot of things with Mine and Lefebvre and Broken Heart. That was the kind of stuff we did. So along the way, though, I started writing. Probably, I think some of the first books I did, I literally wrote on the bus, on the tour bus, going up and down the highways. You have a lot of time on those buses.
Sure.
You not much to do. You can go to the back, go to the front, back, and watch TV. So I started writing, and I wrote this little book. Actually, it wasn't a little book. It was a great big book called Don't Bite the Apple Till You Check for Worms. And it was a book about love, sex, dating, being single, how to find the right person that God has for you, all that sort of thing. And I made every mistake that a young writer could make. I didn't study the market. I didn't know who was buying what kind of books. I didn't know, which publishers were publishing what. I just felt compelled to write this book because every night after our concerts, we'd have an invitation for people to meet Christ. And a lot would. We'd have like 100 or 200 kids almost every night for 20 years out there on the road would come and respond to the invitations. Wow. So we didn't focus on selling records or all the rest of that kind of stuff. We focused on seeing people get saved and their lives changed and filled with the Holy Spirit and going out and becoming disciples for the Lord. That was what our ministry was all about. But in that process there, every night after a concert, we'd be praying with people till midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning at the auditoriums. Meanwhile, the custodians are saying, will you guys get out of here? Will you please leave? But there would always be some young lady or a guy or somebody, young ladies usually a lot of times would have dating issues and say, I'm dating this guy. He's a good guy. He's got a great car. I said, well, is he a Christian? No, he's not. But he treats me great, does he know the Lord? Well, no, but he's really, So I wrote this little book, Don't Bite the Apple Till You Check for Worms. There are a lot of shiny apples out there, but you want the one that God has for you. And really, I wrote it in self-defense because I wanted something I could give to these kids after a concert and say, here, I don't have time to talk to you, at length about all this, but here's some things that might help you. And the book just took off. And that was the first book that I wrote for a major publisher. And it started kicking in gear. A guy had me come into Detroit, Michigan and do some things on the radio there and TV and speak in some churches there. And it just exploded. And I still get letters to this day, all these years later, from people who found that book somewhere. Don't bite the apple till you check for worms. But I wrote it in self-defense, so I could say here.
So you became an author by accident?
Almost, yeah. I always wanted to write.
Okay.
My dad owned a bar, literally a bar, in a coal mining town called Clymer, Pennsylvania. So I would go to work with him at 5 o'clock in the morning. He opened at 7. And in a little western Pennsylvania coal mining town, the guys were either going out to the coal mines or coming in from the coal mines around 7 o'clock. And the place that my dad owned was not a fancy lounge or anything like that. It was a bar. Yeah. and guys coming in filthy dirty or going out filthy dirty to them. But my dad knew them so well. They were regular customers. He'd have their drinks on the counter whenever they came in.
Oh, wow.
So I'd go with him to clean up every morning at 5 in the morning. We opened at 7. But it was too dark, usually in the wintertime, especially in Pennsylvania. And my mom didn't want me to come home at 7 in the morning. So I would stay behind the bar with my dad. And I would write stories about the guys who came to my dad's bar. I can still remember some of those names to this day. Patsy Porto and B.C. Bianco and Mike Keppins. I mean, it was a culture.
Yeah.
And I would write these silly little stories behind the bar, and I made a little newspaper. I wrote about the Little League games and all these other kinds. But that's where I started writing. And it was just kind of like something to do. So I always wanted to be a writer.
Okay.
But when I went to college, where I met your dad, I was actually majoring in psychology, and I was going to probably go into education.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why didn't you go into English or writing for that?
It just never even occurred to me. I didn't see that as a career at that point.
Okay.
I liked it.
Yeah.
I did all this stuff like in school, editor of the school newspaper and all that sort of thing. I really liked it, but I didn't see it as something I could make a living at. And making a living as a writer is, it's kind of like making a living as a musician. It's a miracle in itself.
Yeah.
I actually thought I was going to be like a high school guidance counselor or something like that. It's kind of cool, though, because when I look back on it, the things that I learned in the college where your dad and I attended, you'd say, well, that's all useless stuff. But no, it hasn't been. I've used every bit of that. The psychology, the courses that I've taken there, they've all worked together. God does have a plan that he takes even some of the things that you don't understand, and it's a cumulative thing where he uses all those things to continue to shape our lives. And he sure did mine, even though I didn't know it. But right around that time, I really felt a strong call from the Lord to study the Scripture and to really know what I was talking about. And so I transferred from Indiana to Asbury College and Asbury Theological Seminary in Lexington, Kentucky. There is where I really had some of the most deep and formative spiritual experiences of my life. That's the place where God said, okay, now who's in charge? Are you going to run this thing, or are you going to let me run this thing? And that was where I had to lay my life down and say, okay, Lord, it's yours. Wherever you want to take me, whatever you want to do with my life, I'm yours. I did go back and work with my brothers again in music for 20 years. We were on the road for 20 years.
20 years, and you were writing at the same time.
Writing at the same time. I wrote most of the songs that we sang, and as well as started writing books. And I think I did 9 books while I lived in Pennsylvania there.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was just a neat start. Because of the music, we had an audience.
Right.
So I had a built-in market for the books as well, but also had a good relationship with radio and magazines and things like that. So it was a little easier to promote than if I were just starting out as a writer, cold, because that's hard. So there was an audience there that was interested in what we were doing and what I had to say, and that made things a little bit easier to get started.
Yeah. Well, you just mentioned that God spoke to you while you were at school, and I love asking about how God speaks to people and how you hear God speak. But do you remember the first time that you realized that you heard God speak to you?
Well, I grew up going to church, grew up going to camp meeting with my mom, that sort of thing. So we were always surrounded by God speaking to people and the Spirit of the Lord working and revival, that kind of thing. But remember, my dad owned the biggest bar in the county, so I was in 2 different worlds.
Right.
So it wasn't until I made that real commitment to the Lord that I began to hear from the Lord myself. And a lot of it was through the Scripture. Some of it was through prayer, of course. Some was through wise counselors speaking into my life. And there was an event, and I remember it at Wilkinsburg, at a church there that you've probably attended. There was a time where some pastors got together at a church there, and this was right about that same time where I was saying, what am I supposed to be doing? And they didn't know me, but they gathered around, they prayed for me, and one of the guys there in that group had a word from God. He says, I really feel like you're going to do something in writing of books. Well, I hadn't written any books at that point. I was a drummer in a band, and so it was just a very strange thing. But I heard that, and it spoke to me. And so, in a very real way, God used somebody else to speak into my life. Now, you got to be careful of that, because
absolutely,
not every word that you hear is something that God is saying. But he did confirm that in my spirit, and confirmed it through other things. And when I began to push on those doors, they opened. And that part of that was whenever I left Indiana and went to Asbury, my dad, who was not a Christian at that time, said, why don't you just stay here at Indiana, finish your education here, and then if you want to go study the Bible, go ahead. It made good business sense. My dad was a good businessman.
Yeah.
But I really felt, John, that God was speaking to me saying, you need to go now. And it made no financial sense. I didn't know anybody there, but I knew that they had a big revival there at that college, where the Spirit of the Lord came in, and literally they canceled classes for a week.
No way.
And people were getting saved and filled with the Holy Spirit. One of the local pastors stood up at that time. He said, I've been a pastor here for 13 years at this particular big church. He says, and I've hated you people. It was that kind of powerful revival. It wasn't just putting up a sign and saying we're going to have some services. It was a supernatural spiritual revival.
So this pastor repented.
And his wife.
Wow.
Yeah. And actually I have that just a little bit backward. It was his wife had said that, and he had stood up and said, I've been pastoring this church, big church, and he said, I've not always won the battles with lust in the chambers of my imagination. Isn't that interesting? I still remember him saying that. Yeah. That's exactly what he said. I have not always won the battles with lust in the chambers of my imagination. Now, that's probably true for all of us, but this was the leading pastor in the area standing up and saying this, and people were just, said, yeah, me too, and his wife standing up, we've been here for these years, and I've hated you. Whoa! But she says, God has done a fresh work in my life. And I ask you to forgive me, and he's changing me, and I want to be a better Christian. I want to love you. It was that kind of supernatural revival that took place there. And it went on not just for a day, but went on for 7 solid days, where at no point were there less than 500 people in that auditorium at any time, all through the night.
Wow.
Yeah, it was the coolest thing. So I wanted to be where God was doing those kind of things.
Absolutely.
And that was Asbury College. It's Asbury University now. It's my alma mater. And I went back to the seminary there, which was across the street. So I learned that I knew I wasn't going to be there for long, but I felt God had called me there to learn as much as I could of him and of the scripture in that short period of time. And you know what? When I left there, and everything I've done since that time, all the music over those 20 years, all the books, I think I've done about 95 books or Bible projects now since that time, all of that had its foundations back there during those few years that I was intensely studying the Bible.
So God drew you there. He was like, I have to get Ken to Asbury for this time because it's going to set him up for the rest of his life.
It was so weird. I didn't know anything about the place before that time. One pastor, local pastor.
And this is before the internet, so you couldn't just look things up. It was,
internet, that's the truth. No way. Yeah, we didn't have GPS to find it either. But it was a great school, and if you check it out in history, it's put out some fantastic leaders in America and around the world and in missions, and really, really cool. But it was transformational for me for a couple of reasons. Number one, I was coming in, I thought, well, here I am, the cool kid coming in from the university, and I'm going to this little flunky school here in Kentucky. Well, the first 4 professors I had were absolutely brilliant. I mean, not just smart; they were absolutely brilliant. But they loved God. They had a passion for touching the world, and they knew their stuff. And so I was incredibly challenged. I mean, deeply. I studied like crazy. I studied like crazy, and I got good grades because it was the most important thing for me. I wasn't concerned about playing on the football team or the basketball team. I love sports, but I knew that God had called me there for that period in my life to prepare for what he wanted to do for the rest of my life.
Yeah, it's awesome to see when you know that God has given you purpose for something, and he says, okay, now here's what I'm going to do to get you equipped. You really jump in with both feet.
Yeah, I did.
That's what I did whenever I did my radio school. I wasn't the best student growing up, and I wasn't very self-motivated with that either. But whenever God sent me to South Africa for my radio school, I jumped in with both feet, and I got the best grades that I've ever gotten in my life. So it's really cool to see that similar experience with you, where you knew that God was calling you there, and you were there 110%.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and it didn't matter how much time it took or how much effort or anything like that. I would pour myself into the studies and the ministry at the same time. And then I was still on the road with my brothers when I left the school. I was still on the road with them. And even sometimes when I would come home for breaks at Christmas and other breaks throughout the year, I'd go back out on the road with them. But there was something different about me. It wasn't just Ken going out and trying to say something or do something that was going to have some effect. It was the Spirit of the Lord in my life and through my life. And man, that made all the difference in the world.
Yeah. So how did you get from writing a couple books on your own to helping other people write some really impressive books?
Well, you're very kind. Actually, it was one of those places where you're at a crossroads.
Yeah.
And I had been here in Nashville. I can't remember how many years I had been here in Nashville at that point, but I had 2 little girls, and we'd bought a new house in Nashville. Had 2 new cars, and I was struggling to make a living because I was writing books for kids at that time. And then way back then, Don't Bite the Apple Until You Check for Worms and Designer Jeans and some of those other books I wrote early on, they were selling those books for like $5.95 in the bookstores.
Yeah, that's not gonna pay the bills too much.
Yeah, and I was a fledgling writer. I was new, so my royalty rate was probably 7 to 10%. So you're getting 50 or 60 cents per book,
Yeah.
And you got to sell a lot of books.
Absolutely.
To make a house payment. And so it got to the place where I said, God, I know you've called me to do this, and I'm here, and I'm available to you. I said, but I can't make a living at this. And I was doing some speaking and some other things at the same time, but we weren't going under, but it was just extremely difficult. I said, I can't make a living and take care of my kids and my family. So I'm going to go to this book convention. At that time, it was what they called the CBA convention, the Christian Booksellers Association convention, which has pretty much gone away nowadays. But it was big at that time. It had about 14,500 people attending this convention. So I'm going to go to this book convention. All the publishers are there, a lot of writers, music people. And I said, if I don't get some significant work, I'm going to have to move back to Pennsylvania. I know I can get a job back in Pennsylvania, but this writing thing isn't working for me.
Yeah.
So I went to that convention, and I literally, at that convention, people were almost throwing projects at me. I remember going down the hallway, and one of the publishers that I knew by name, but I'd never worked with him before. He stopped literally in the middle of the hall, and he stopped. He says, "Ken," he says, "Man," he said, "you are exactly the guy that I'm looking for." And he said, "I've got this baseball book I want to do." He said, "with Gary Carter, who was with the New York Mets and Montreal Expos." He said, "And you'd be perfect." He knew that I had a Little League background with my dad, who ran the Little League program in Pennsylvania there for 40 years. And he said, "He would be perfect for this." I mean, I came back from that conference, John, with 9 book projects.
What?
9, real deal contracts, book projects.
So this isn't just like, hey, let's talk more about this later. You had contracts in hand.
Yeah, well, not in hand at that time, but agreements.
Sure.
That we're going to do this. Yeah, and that was the good news. I had 9 book projects. The bad news was I had 9 book deadlines.
Yeah.
They don't call them deadlines without a reason. It's like, we want it now. But one of those books, as I mentioned, was with Gary Carter. Baseball player, professional baseball player, had won the World Series in 1988, and Oral Hershiser beat him in '89, I think. But anyhow, that was my first collaboration with a high-profile celebrity-type sports figure or newsmaker or whatever. And I discovered that I loved telling somebody else's story more than I did my own.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah, it's just fun, and it was great, and that was the first, and it worked. And then I did Paul Azinger's book, Professional Golfer, and a story with Payne Stewart's wife after the plane crash in which he died. Jim Baker's book, when the fall of Heritage USA, the publisher called me and said, "Would you go over and talk to Jim Baker?" He had just gotten out of prison. It's kind of funny because publishers don't always play straight.
Okay.
They had told Jim that they wanted to do a book about his prison experience. So Jim was excited about that because now that he'd gotten out of prison, he wanted to tell the story and everything.
And he had a deeper encounter with the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely. And
the only thing he had to read was the Bible. So
that's right. Yeah. That's exactly right. And it changed his life. So he was excited about talking about those prison years. Well, the publisher told me, they said, "We want the whole Heritage USA story, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything."
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going into my first meeting with Jim Baker thinking that he wants to tell the Heritage USA story. He had no clue and had no desire. So anyhow, my first meeting, I asked him a question that I shouldn't have asked, and he just turned his head to the side like that and looked out the window for about a half hour. So I quickly learned that wasn't the approach. But it turned out to be a great book. And it was called I Was Wrong. And it was one of the first major books I had done with a minister.
So how did, after that half hour ended, how did you guys get back on the same page?
Well, I realized that I had to start at the beginning. I went back and we started talking about his prison experience. But it was 6 months we worked on that book before I ever asked him about the fall of Heritage USA or PTL or Jessica Hahn or some of those ugly things that took place there. But it turned out to be a great book. And we worked so hard on that book, and Jim was great. He had nothing. Franklin Graham had set him up in a little house over in Asheville, almost like a cabin, a farm cabin. When he left Heritage, he was at the top of the world and all that. But everybody kind of abandoned him.
Sure.
And nobody wanted to be around him anymore. But Franklin Graham set him up, basically paid for a place for him to live. The first week that he was there, Franklin took him to church at Montreat, and Jim sat in the Billy Graham's row, his pew, I guess you say, and Mrs. Graham, Ruth Graham, came in late on purpose, and she made a point of coming in and sitting down right next to Jim Baker, and it was a statement. It was really a cool statement. And one of the most incredible stories that I've ever had a chance to tell was Jim Baker in prison, and when he was there, he was literally cleaning the restrooms, and that was not a place you wanted to be, and they kept him there. For 5 years, they kept him there cleaning the restrooms. Ordinarily, you'd kind of they put you in different jobs. They kept Jim there on purpose. Again, it was a statement. And he was cleaning the restroom one day, filthy, his tennis shoes all slimy and everything. And they said, "Baker, you've got a visitor." He said, I don't have any visitors. I don't want any visitors. They said, no, we think you want this visitor. So he went to the warden's office, and there's Jim Baker in his filthy commode cleaning clothes, and there in the warden's office was Billy Graham, and Billy had come to visit Jim Baker. Wow. And he wrapped his arms around Jim Baker, and Jim just wept. And it was just a turning point in his life. He thought his life was over. He thought nobody ever, cared or would ever care to see him ever again. But Billy Graham, he had that kind of courage and that kind of, that kind of compassion. So the Graham family really was instrumental in helping Jim get his life back together when he came out of prison. That's what I was walking into, though, whenever they asked me to come and tell that story.
Okay.
So that was the first major ministry kind of story that I told, and I've told a bunch since that time. But I found that I love doing the interviews. I love digging in, doing the research with people. And since that time, I've done everybody from Buzz Aldrin, who'd walked on the moon, with Neil Armstrong, and Chuck Norris was always fun. I did Chuck. Joel Osteen did a couple of books with Joel. Let's Roll was a big book in Western Pennsylvania, of course. Shanksville.
Right, Lisa Beamer.
Yeah, Lisa Beamer story with Flight 93. We did that book. And the cool thing about it, John, all those gifts that God had given to me, and the things he'd given to me as kind of a pastoral heart and all the rest of that, all came into play with what he had me to do with writing books.
Yeah.
Because what I do is more about the heart than it is even the words on the page. Most of the people that I work with, they could write their own books, but for some reason they call me. And I've discovered that if I go in and I'm a bit of a friend and I'm a bit of a counselor sometimes and a bit of a pastor, sometimes a little bit of a psychologist and sometimes a little bit of a psychiatrist, if I do all those things well, I might have the opportunity to put the nouns and the verbs in the right order.
Okay.
If I don't do those things, it's just going to be a magazine article. It'll just be a puff piece or whatever. But what I do is we really try to get the heart on paper.
Right.
And to go into those things, the hurt and the pain and the adversity that somebody's dealt with, and then to bring that out on the positive side. I guess if there's any niche that I've fallen into, that would be it. My wife says that Barry Manilow wrote the songs that make people cry. She says, you write the books that make people cry. And I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but I've done a bunch of them.
So what advice would you have for me about finding those deeper stories? Because this is something that I enjoy doing.
Sure.
And I always want to get better as an interviewer, better as somebody that's looking for the deeper story in somebody else's life.
Sure.
Because I want to learn from you. I want to learn from the people that I talk with. And hopefully the people that listen to these as well are gaining wisdom and knowledge and understanding from that as well. But what advice would you have for me to do that?
Couple things I think are important. Number one, of course, you need to do your research beforehand.
Yeah.
I never go into an interview with somebody, a potential book project, without studying as much as I can about that person. It's not always easy to get the whole picture, but you'll get a lot nowadays online, that sort of thing, but you can never really believe what you find online. I mean, there are all kinds of things out there that are absolutely false, and you're walking into an interview with somebody and you're going to base your interview on that, you're in trouble. So you have to do your research. But more than that, I try to ask those open-ended questions that most of the people I work with are high-profile celebrities or newsmakers. They're used to doing interviews. They're used to giving sound bites. Sound bites are not what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for the trite little answer or the cutesy thing. I'm looking like, okay, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? How did that affect your kids? I'll give you a good example. I had one of the toughest books I ever did was with Scott Waddell, who was the commander of the USS Greenville submarine.
Okay.
That came up too soon and actually hit a Japanese fishing boat off the shores of Hawaii and killed 9. They said students, but they were basically college age and above. But it was a tragedy, and it was one of the first things in the George W. Bush administration that hit the news. I was trying to work with Scott. He's a nuclear submarine commander to tell this story. Well, he's either used to giving brief interviews or no information at all. And I got to write this story. And I would have been just unable to do it had I not had the opportunity to talk to his wife. And we worked for months on this story, and and he's a nuclear submarine guy. He knows nuclear. He's not going to be giving away trade secrets. But when I finally had a chance to talk with his wife, she was the one that told me how all the other kids, they lived at Ford Island in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. That's where they lived. She was the one that told me how all the other kids in the school were making fun of their daughter. Your daddy is the one that destroyed a nuclear submarine. Your daddy, and what it was like to be literally drummed out of the Navy. Navy. They allowed him to retire, but pretty much it was like, okay, we don't want you to be here anymore. And she brought the emotion that Scott would not let down enough to reveal. And sometimes you have to do that. You have to kind of go around the person.
Yeah.
I recently did a book with Randy Travis. Randy Travis had a stroke in 2013.
Oh, yeah.
He couldn't tell me those stories. So I had to go find those stories and bring them back. And then basically his wife literally read them to Randy after I'd written them and said, Randy, is this right? Does that sound right? It took about 2 years to get that book done.
Wow.
But asking those kind of questions that the person is much more interested in talking about rather than just sound bites. The other thing, as I mentioned already, I really do try to get the heart on paper.
Yeah.
Most of the people I work with, their stories are out there. They're either in the news or they made a mark on society in some way where people know about them. But what don't they know? What don't they know? What shaped this person? What are the things that they're passionate about? Those are the kind of questions I like to ask.
Yeah. One of the things that I like to do is if there's going to be somebody that I'm going to be interviewing or somebody that I'm doing a pre-interview for the TV show, I'll look and see who else has interviewed them, and then what questions did they miss?
Oh, yeah.
I want to make sure that we talk about.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But I always want to make sure that I'm trying to grow as an interviewer and grow as a conversationalist, because you can learn a lot more in a conversation than you can in an interview.
Yeah. Well, and I find that true even now when people are interviewing me sometimes, and I'll find sometimes, like somebody will be taking shorthand notes and all that sort of thing. What you're doing here today with me is much more effective. Just putting a recorder on, let's talk.
Yeah.
You can't write as fast as you can record.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And you can go back and listen to that and say, okay, what are the nuances? And that was the other thing I learned early on in my career. Whenever I'm working with somebody, I maintain eye contact right here. Now, like with somebody like Buzz Aldrin, that can be dangerous.
Why is that?
Because Buzz is he's so brilliant.
Okay.
I mean, he's definitely the brightest guy I've ever met.
Really?
But he is also passionate about space, and the only thing Buzz cares about is getting to Mars. So if he were in our conversation right now, we would have been talking about going to Mars probably 20 minutes ago, because that's all he cares about. He doesn't care about the Steelers. He doesn't care about politics unless they're interested in financing the space program. But he's so smart. He would talk for hours and hours. But I would record just like we are today, because I know there's a nugget in there somewhere.
Right.
But if I let my gaze drop off here, he'd be off onto something else. So I just maintain that eye contact.
Yeah. I totally believe that everybody that God brings us in contact with along our way, that he's deposited something in them that we can benefit from learning.
Yeah.
We can benefit from digging that out of them.
That's right.
And likewise, that people can learn things from us. And so if we're listening to each other through conversations, God will help us dig those things out through the Holy Spirit's help.
That's right. Yeah, and there were things, even like Buzz is a good example of that, because when in our conversation, he happened to mention that he had taken communion elements to the moon.
I'd heard about that, yeah.
And it was a little known story. I said, Buzz, you took wine or grape juice or something? He said, yeah. He says, we weren't allowed to take very many things because the weight issues on the lunar module were very, very crucial. So even down to the number of pens that they took and that sort of thing, everything was accounted for. But they allowed him to take communion elements. And when they first landed on the moon, they shut down the engines and they checked to make sure they could get back off the moon. Yeah. The first thing that Buzz did was to take communion. And they didn't allow him to say over the air what he was doing, because there had been a fuss over Apollo 8 where they had read the scriptures and in the beginning God and all that sort of thing from Genesis. So Madeleine O'Hara, an atheist lady, had put up a big fuss about that. And so the folks at NASA said, look, okay, we know you want to do this, but just don't make a big deal about it on the live on
the broadcast.
And the transmissions from space. So what he did, he said, let's all give thanks in our own way. And his own way was taking communion. So the first things that were ever eaten or consumed, any liquids consumed on the moon, were the elements representing the cross of Jesus Christ and his death for us. But Buzz did that. Yeah, and it was just so cool. Yeah,
I just got chills. That's so cool.
And I said, Buzz, we got to write this, And he said, well, okay. So it's that kind of thing. When I worked with Joel Osteen, it was very similar. Joel, some people love Joel. Some people get mad at Joel.
Right.
They say, he doesn't talk about this or that. He knows all that stuff, but he's chosen to do the sort of thing he's doing. But I remember when
I love that he's reaching the people that God has called him to reach.
Yeah, exactly. And he knows what he's doing, and it's not accidental. But I remember when we were working on his first book, it was called Your Best Life Now, and we got a lot of flack about that title. Even somebody said, you can't have your best life now. You don't get your best life till you're in heaven. But he's saying, hey, you can be better now than what you have been. I remember we were talking just around the kitchen table and sitting there, and we were talking about the favor of God. The favor of God. Joel kept coming up, using that phrase, the favor of God. Now, in the Greek language, it's the same word as grace, charis, and it's the same concept as grace. But for Joel, he wasn't talking so much about grace so much as he was talking about the favor of God. I said, man, Joel, I've never heard anybody talk about that in that way. And he would talk about his mom being healed, his mom, Dodie Osteen, being healed. And the doctors had given up on her. And she'd gone down to like 83 pounds or something like that. Wow. And her skin had turned yellow. I said, Joel, we've got to tell that story. But it came out of just conversations like we're doing right here. And that book went on. And at this point, I think it sold something like 10 million copies.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, and it keeps on going. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's just that kind of conversation where you find those things that really matter to that person. And it's been fun for me.
Yeah.
And I get to live vicariously through all the people that I work with. So it's a matter of continuing education, I'm learning all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. You would have to be, because all the people that, I'm looking at the pile of books on your desk right here. 'Cause we're in your office, which has an amazing, beautiful library here. But the people, we have Buzz Aldrin, Randy Travis, you mentioned Chuck Norris.
Yeah.
You did a boxer, I think, too.
Oh, George Foreman, yeah.
George Foreman.
Yeah, I did two books with George, yeah.
That is a wide variety of people that you've had interaction and wrote their stories. How do you keep it all straight?
Oh, man. What was funny about George Foreman, especially because I had done a book with John Ashcroft before George Foreman. And John Ashcroft he's just so smart.
Yeah.
He was the Attorney General of the United States with George Bush on 9/11. Working with him was just an incredible experience. John would use words. I'd have to come home and look up those words. With George, I'd have to come home and make up words. It was just a totally different world, but they were both incredible, and he was so much fun. George was just this gregarious guy.
Yeah.
But the publishers, I did two books with George. I did one is his life story, God in My Corner, which talks about how he became a Christian after a devastating loss in the boxing ring. He was mean before that. George, if you want to see a guy that has been transformed, look at George Foreman before Jesus and George Foreman after Jesus.
Yeah.
And that smile and the joy that is in his life. So it was really cool working with him. And but working with John Ashcroft, though, before him that was difficult. Yeah. I love John. And John, he was so bright, but he was there on 9/11. Of course, he was the Attorney General and had to come up with things like the Patriot Act and things like that had never been done before.
Yeah.
After I worked with John, a number of years later, I worked with Alberto Gonzales, who was the Attorney General after John Ashcroft.
Okay.
John retired after 4 years. It's a tough job. He left Washington. And Alberto Gonzales had been George Bush's chief counsel in Texas and had come along to be his chief counsel in the White House. So he had served as chief counsel for 4 years. He was the guy who was tasked with figuring out, what are we going to do with these guys we're capturing in Afghanistan after 9/11? Where are we going to put them? How are we going to, how are we going to prosecute them? Because most of them were not captured under our legal system that we have here. So, Guantanamo Bay, the surveillance system that they used to track down emails and cell phone calls from Al Qaeda, all that came under his purview.
Oh, wow.
So when we began working together, he was very, very intense about not giving away any classified information. He was just committed to that. Just really a noble fellow and with incredible integrity. So I have a stack of books there on my desk, and I keep them there for a reason. But those are all the books I had to read just so I could communicate with Alberto Gonzales.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to take a picture of that. So
talking
really
about
a big stack.
It is. It's something like 13 or 14 books. Everybody from Donald Rumsfeld to Dick Cheney's book, Condoleezza Rice. I had to read all their books so that I could even have a conversation with Alberto Gonzales. We were talking about research and that sort of thing earlier, because he was not going to give any classified information away. But if I asked him certain things, then he could answer. So that was a difficult book.
Yeah.
But it was a learning experience for me as well.
Yeah. So One of the things I love asking people is, where have you seen Jesus walking with you along your way that you don't realize it in the moment, but as you look back, you can see that?
One of the most significant ways I saw Jesus walking, not only with me, but with my whole family, was when my mom began to show signs of dementia.
Oh, okay.
And I did write a book about it, of course. And if it happens in my life, I'm going to write about it.
Yeah.
And I wrote a little book called When Your Parent Becomes Your Child.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew nothing about dementia. I knew nothing about Alzheimer's. That kind of stuff happened to somebody else.
Right.
That didn't happen to our family. And it hadn't. My dad had died of a heart attack. We'd had other things in our family, but we never had Alzheimer's or dementia. But my mom, godly Christian woman, people in the Pittsburgh area, many people would remember her standing at places like the Holiday House. Your brother and your uncle would remember my mom standing on the stage at the Holiday House with her arms raised to the Lord, praising God. She began to show signs of dementia, and we didn't even know what that was. But she was forgetting things. She'd be angry. She would be using words the good Christian lady wouldn't use. She knew those words from her childhood. But we began to experience some things with my mom that just were strange. But along that line, the Lord never left her. And that was the marvelous thing about over the last 3 years of her life, we walked through her. And that is one of the places where walking with Jesus was very, very intimate. Yeah. Because I kept saying, God, what is this all about? I mean, why is she still here? She's in her 80s. She's loved you all of her life. She's served you all of her life. She's ready to go to heaven. That's all she thinks about, talks about. Why is she still here? Yeah. And I realized that it wasn't just for my mom that she was still here, but she was still here for us. And there were things that I needed to learn through that experience as well.
What are some of those things?
What life is all about, how to die well, all the rest of that, how to stay in touch with the Lord even when you're going through adversity, which she certainly was. The things that really matter, not the car you drive or the house you live in. It was her faith in Jesus. And she never lost that to the day she died. She couldn't tell you where she was. She couldn't tell you whether she had breakfast today or that sort of thing. We had an event here at the house where my wife Lisa invited a lot of the folks from our Sunday school class. I teach a Sunday school class at Christ Church. I've been doing that for 17 years. And so she invited about 50 people to come to our house here. And we had a guy set up a Kurzweil keyboard out here in the living room. And we all had hymn books. My mom just sat up at the Kurzweil and piano and just started playing. And people would call out a song, Minnie, play this, Minnie, play that. Remember, she didn't know where she was. She didn't know what day it was. She didn't know if she'd had breakfast or if she'd, ever. But she played every one of those songs by heart, without any music, without a hymn book or without any, anything. And not only was she playing, but she's singing along, and then she's saying, hey, come on, you sing. It was the coolest thing. God was showing us different things through that experience. How to love somebody that's maybe dying of cancer, somebody that's has some debilitating disease like Alzheimer's disease. I remember when we first realized what was going on, and I didn't. I was living in denial. My wife figured it out first that something's not right here, so she took my mom to a geriatric doctor. Okay. Because we were taking her, just to your regular physicians, and they would give her more pills and pills for this and pills for that. So my wife took her to a geriatric doctor, and she says, next time you need to go. I said, okay, fine. So the first time I sat down with the geriatric doctor, we're sitting almost as close as we are here today. He's right where you are. My mom's right here, and Lisa, my wife, is right here. And he looks at me, he says, Ken, this is not going to change. He said, it's going to get worse. I wanted to punch the guy, John. Yeah. First of all, I said, who are you to say this? I mean, I've seen my mom.
You're supposed to make her better.
Yeah, that's right. You're supposed to make her better. Yeah, but I've seen her literally get up off her bed and go out and do a concert in front of thousands of people. I mean, and not only that, we're Christians. We believe in praying, and you know what? God can heal her. And so I was mad, but you know what? He was right. And he became a good friend, and he walked with us those 3 years, and he literally became Jesus for us in many situations, walking with us through those situations and helping us to deal with stuff that I had never dreamed that we would deal with before. It's a weird deal when you're putting diapers on the person who once put diapers on you. Yeah. That whole role reversal, it'll mess with your emotions. It'll mess with your, and not to mention the faith issues. But in the midst of all that, God was with us. And so I wrote that little book, When Your Parent Becomes Your Child. And it's probably the most intimate book that I've done in my whole life, because it reveals a little bit of our own thoughts and feelings and spiritual experiences.
Yeah, I know a little bit about what that season of life is like when my grandparents on my mom's side were older and they were getting ready to pass away. My mom had to change their diapers and take care of them in that same way. And just seeing the love and the care that she had for them. And, she talked a lot about that role reversal and how difficult that can be. But also there was an intimacy with that. There was another layer of love that just kind of came there.
Yeah, and you have to laugh sometimes. I mean, you can get mad and all that, and sometimes you cry. But you have to laugh too and maintain a sense of humor about it all. But most of all, just to be there for the person who has been there for you. Yeah. And boy, it was a great experience for our family. It was weird at times. I remember one of my daughters saying, she said, "Dad, that doesn't even sound like Grandma," because it didn't. Yeah. My mom started telling our kids stories about when she was a young lady in World War II and doing some things she shouldn't have been doing. I said, "Okay, Mom, that's enough. We don't really need to get down that road anymore." Yeah. But it was a special time, and along the way for us was a difficult time. Yeah. But boy, I would not trade it. Yeah. I would not trade it. And I knew when she took her last breath here in Tennessee that she would take her first breath in the presence of Jesus. So there was that hope and that confidence. Sure, there was sadness, but somebody asked me. They said, "Well, you're probably relieved now that it's all over, aren't you?" And I said, "No, not really. I mean, it wasn't a burden. It was hard at times, but it wasn't a burden to take care of her. It was a privilege. The Bible says if we honor our mothers and our fathers, if we honor our parents, God's going to take care of us. He's going to honor us. And he has certainly done that with me. But it was a privilege to take care of my mom during those last couple of years of her life and to be there. And she never lost touch with the Spirit of God. The night she died, Bill Gaither's group came on. Bill and I had done a book together, and so we always had a lot of Bill Gaither music around her. But the night she died, Bill Gaither's group came on TV, and they were singing Sweet Holy Spirit. And remember, my mom could barely function, but she began singing along with those guys on TV, Sweet Holy Spirit. Amen. You can't put a price on that kind of stuff. No. It was just amazing. God was with us all along that journey.
Wow, that's powerful. Thank you for sharing about that.
Oh, yeah.
Ken, you've written more than 90 books, 95, I think you said.
I got to get a real job one of these days.
One of these days. You've picked up a lot of great advice along the way. I mean, people that you've talked with, you've written their books, people that you just had conversations with, you've given great advice. If you could give some advice to a younger Ken, you can go back in time, have coffee with yourself, whatever it is, where on that timeline would you interact with yourself, and what advice would you give yourself?
Well, the advice that is usually given to young writers is to write what you know, and that makes sense. But I'm just the opposite. I'd say look for those things that you don't know. Look for those new experiences and that you're willing to learn. And I've learned from every single person I've worked with. Joe Gibbs, we did a book called Racing to Win. Joe is the only professional coach to win championships in 2 different sports. Three Super Bowl rings, and what's he got? How many NASCAR championships does he have now? The guy knows.
He knows how to win.
How to motivate people. Yeah, working with Joe was incredible for me, and I knew nothing about NASCAR at that point. Floor it and turn left was all I knew. That was it. But man, did I learn about that whole industry and everything. So looking for those things that you don't know. I worked with a psychologist, Neil Clark Warren, and he started this little company called eHarmony.com.
Okay.
Again, just
been on that.
Bright guy, yeah. And it's a great company. And Neil started it from scratch. Matter of fact, his big problem was the first person who signed up, he didn't know, okay, who am I supposed to match them with now, because he literally started it from one person.
Oh, wow.
But he was a clinical psychologist for 38 years dealing with marriage issues. And for 38 years, and he was also the dean of the Fuller School of Psychology, Fuller Theological Seminary. But he said, for 38 years, I kept trying to put people back together, put their marriages back together, people who should never have been married in the first place, at least not married to each other, because they're so different. They're so different from each other. One person wants to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. One person wants to sleep till 10. One person wants to make $1 million. One person wants to go, feed the homeless people in Africa someplace. He said they just have different values. They're so different. And his whole thing was, we say opposites attract, but he said, but then when they're married, then opposites attack. So we're talking about these kind of things. And he started telling me about these 29 dimensions of a good relationship, and that he had basically put together for eHarmony whenever they started eHarmony.com. And so we wrote a little book called Falling in Love for All the Right Reasons. It was a whole new world for me, but it was just so much fun working with him, and it was expanding my horizons all the time. So I tell young writers to look for those things that you don't know. The book I mentioned about Alberto Gonzalez. Wow. I mean, we got into things about our Constitution, about affirmative action, about some of the things that go on in Washington now, classified information things, and all this. I didn't know those things. I had to learn those things.
Yeah.
So it was fun for me. And it's just a continuing education along the line. I found a story here in Tennessee that I did not know. I'd lived in Tennessee for 30 years before I found this story. And it was a story in 1970 in Gallatin, Tennessee, where the state championship team was known as the Gallatin Green Wave. They were just an incredible basketball team. That year, though, there was another school, Union High School, an all-black school. Okay. And we're in Tennessee as we're speaking here now. And at that time, in 1970, there were still signs above the water fountains saying white only. If a black guy would go into a department store in some of the towns here in Tennessee and try on a sports jacket, no white person would ever buy that jacket. The black kids would swim in one swimming pool. The white kids would swim in another swimming pool. The racial tension was very real. And where we sit here today, we're only an hour and a half from where the Ku Klux Klan was founded. So in 1970, there was all that kind of tension. Guys coming back from Vietnam, the racial tensions were 2 hours away, about 3 hours away from where Martin Luther King had been shot two years prior to that. So in 1970, the Gallatin High School basketball team and the Union High School basketball team are going to meet for the very first time in history on the same basketball court. The black kids were not allowed in the white school. If the black basketball team played in a white basketball court, they weren't allowed to take a shower in the locker room. They weren't allowed to put their clothes in there. It was that kind of culture.
I just can't comprehend that actually happened.
My kids can't comprehend that, John, because they've grown up with a whole different kind of world. But this was 1970, and they met on the basketball court that night. They played for 3 quarters, tie game, and a little white boy, blonde-haired boy, about 5'10", might have been about 5'9", I think, blue-eyed, white, all the typical quintessential Caucasian characteristics, scored 14 points in the last quarter, and Gallatin won. So they called him out as the most valuable player, and he's coming out and he's crying because he won. They call out this young black boy, Bill Ligon, big afro haircut and that sort of thing, and they call him out as the runner-up, and he's crying too. He didn't even want to come out onto the middle of the gymnasium floor, but he did eventually, and he's crying too because he lost. But not only has he lost, but there's never going to be another chance to redeem himself because Union High School will be no more. It's being submerged into Gallatin High School in the following year. Yeah, so he's bawling, and Eddie Sherlin, the white boy, is bawling, and in the midst of that racial tension, and the entire gymnasium was surrounded by police officers that night. In the midst of that racial tension, this blonde-haired, blue-eyed white boy goes across that gymnasium and hugs a sweaty black boy. You didn't do that here in Tennessee in 1970. The whole gymnasium fell silent. Everybody thought it was going to be a riot. Everybody thought, the place was going to explode. And not just for a minute, but for several minutes, it was just absolutely quiet in the gymnasium, packed gymnasium. And then finally, somebody began to clap. And then somebody else began to clap. And then the whole place erupted in applause. And John Sigenthaler, who was the editor of the Nashville Tennessean and was one of the founding editors of USA Today, John was a key figure in some of the racial situations here in Tennessee in the 60s. He told me, he said he thought that was a turning point in racial relationships here in this area, in this city. And it wasn't a politician. It wasn't even a preacher. 2 kids on a basketball court. But what they didn't know was that Eddie Sherlin had become a Christian. Eddie Sherlin had become a Christian, the white boy. He'd become a Christian. And he said, it's not right that we treat black people the way we're treating these people. And Eddie Sherlin lived literally on the line between the white part of town and the black part of town. And as little kids, he and Bill had played basketball together. And they had been friends. And then Bill had moved to another side of the town, and they hadn't seen each other for years. But it was what the Lord had done in their lives that God used to change this whole culture that we're sitting in here right now in Tennessee. Amazing. So, and I just found that story a few years ago. So I wrote it. It's called More Than Rivals, and they're making a movie of it now. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So, I can't wait to see that.
Yeah, me too. I'll be interested to see how they do it. So I get a chance to tell those stories, John. I mean, I'm just a guy from Clymer, Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
My friends in Clymer are still waiting for me to get a real job. They say, you do what? You write books? I read a book one time.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Ken, do you have a life verse that just kind of has been a guide for your for your life?
Well, of course, a couple, but the one that I sign on all the books that I autograph, I always sign Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't even lean on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Or in some translation says, make your paths straight. And that's what he's done for me. That's what he's done for me. Another key verse for me is Galatians 2:20, where Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ. And it's not even me that's alive anymore, but it's Christ Jesus alive in me and through me. The life I live now, I live by faith in the Son of God who gave himself up for me. That's where I want to live. And truthfully, in my career, that's where I've tried to live. For years, I never had a website. The one I have now, I don't even know how to get on. Somebody called me the other day and said, hey, your website's not working. I said, oh, really? Where is it? So I barely had a business card. But but the Lord brought people into my life and stories into my life that I could tell. And the old saying, we'd say it's not so much your ability as so much as your availability.
Right.
That is so true. It's so true. And that's really been the story of my career, my whole life. And I never dreamed that, maybe I did dream. Maybe I did, and I just didn't know how it would turn out. But I didn't know that it would have the impact that it has.
Yeah.
And we never know, what God's going to do. But when we surrender our lives to him and say, Lord, here I am. You can take my life, use my life, pour me out wherever you want to do. Wow. He says, okay. Yeah, okay, I've got a place for you.
Yeah, he takes us seriously when we say that.
Yeah.
We just got to be available and willing whenever he says,
Absolutely.
okay, now I'm going to call you on that.
Yeah, that's right. So, and I thought I'd have a career in music. Spent 20 years on the road playing drums. Yeah. But you know what? Again, it wasn't wasted, because how many books have I done now with musicians? Stephen Curtis Chapman, Randy Travis, Jimmy Wayne, the book there, Julie Roberts, country music artist. I've just done a bunch of, and Michael W. Smith and I are working on a project right now. So God set me up with the experience. I did a book with a lady, a Southern gospel singer, famous Southern gospel singer by the name of Vestal Goodman. And she said, she says, now, can I tell you some of these stories, but you probably don't want to know what it's like to be out there on the road living in a bus. I said, well, Vestal, kind of do.
Wow.
So nothing is wasted, John. God uses those experiences in our life, even the tough times.
Yeah.
He uses those things.
That's really encouraging. Ken, you've written a lot of books and you've read a lot of books just for fun as well as research for that. What's a book that has changed your life that you would recommend for me?
Two. One would be Loving God by Charles Coulson. Charles Coulson was in the Richard Nixon administration and became a Christian after Watergate. Really after he went to jail for being involved in Watergate,
right. And
started prison fellowship. Incredible guy. I always loved to hear Chuck Coulson whenever an interviewer would have him on a newscast or something, because he was so articulate about the Christian faith. And sometimes, in interviews, they'll pull in people that really don't know what they're talking about, don't represent Christianity very well. Chuck Coulson always did. He really did. He studied. He knew what he was talking about. And one of the early books that he wrote, after he wrote a book called Born Again, and then Life Sentence, I think was his second book, somewhere around that early period in his life, in his second career as a Christian writer and with prison fellowship, he wrote Loving God. It's a series of stories of people's lives who have been changed by the love of God and how they, in loving God, went out to help other people change their lives. Cool book. One of my favorites. On the other side of the spectrum, of course, more secular kind of mainstream book would be David McCullough's books. Everything David McCullough writes, I read. Obviously his John Adams book, his book on Paris was fantastic. Even the Wright brothers, which was kind of a thin book, but his book on Truman. Anything David McCullough writes, I read. But there's a cool connection with David McCullough and me in my career, because one of the first books that David McCullough wrote was the Johnstown Flood. The Johnstown Flood, Western Pennsylvania. That wasn't very far from where I lived. And I remember reading that book when I lived in a little town of Clymer, Pennsylvania, and I said, wow, this guy writes, it sounds like a novel, but he's talking about history. But he makes it so exciting that and the Johnstown flood, for people who don't know, was in Conemaugh Valley. They had a dam there, and some of the folks from Pittsburgh had a beautiful dam that they'd come out of, their fishing dam, and the Carnegies and the Mellons and other wealthy folks from Pittsburgh had this fishing dam, but it was an earthen dam, and it was above the city of Johnstown, and I think it was 1896. It had a very rainy season, and the pressure built and built and built, and eventually the middle of that dam just exploded, and a wall of about 30 or 40 feet of water began racing down the hill toward the city of Johnstown and just devastated the place.
There's no real warning for the people in the city at all.
No.
The Johnstown Flood Museum is pretty interesting.
Yes, it is. Yeah. That's right. McCullough told that story, though, and he didn't tell it as a news item. He told it almost as a novel. And when I read that, I said, whew, man, I want to do something like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So David McCullough is still one of my literary heroes.
Yeah. The 16th Street Bridge in Pittsburgh is named after him.
Ah, there you go.
David McCullough
I didn't know
Bridge.
that.
Yeah.
That is cool.
Yeah, it's Roberto Clemente, the Andy Warhol, and the Rachel Carson. I know that Roberto Clemente is the 6th Street because that's right into the PNC Park. But the others, and then the 16th is the next one up, and that's the David McCullough Bridge.
Wow, that's great.
But most people don't call it that. That's what it is.
Well, seriously, he's one of the guys that I look to as a role model. Very articulate guy, very bright guy, but just does a great job of making those pictures come to life. I've enjoyed his books, and he came to Nashville here to speak not too long ago, and just listening to that guy, I said, "Wow, yeah, that's the standard right there."
That's
I feel like I'm in kindergarten, and he's he's on the graduate level.
Very cool. Well, there's a few books in here that I definitely I'd like to read. The Buzz Aldrin one is one that's really interesting because I love space as well. Ken, thank you so much for giving me some time to sit with you and to learn from your journey with Christ along the way.
Thank you,
and
John.
Allow me to join you along your way just a little bit.
Well, let's do it again. It's fun. And it's always kind of scary to talk to an author because writing is a very isolated deal, and when you let an author get away from his desk and get away from the computer, it can turn into a nightmare. So, but thank you.
This has been a blast. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Ken really has a special ability to get the heart on paper, and it's easy to see that he is truly a gifted communicator. I love how Ken wrote the book Don't Bite the Apple Until You Check for Worms in self-defense. His group, the Watchmen, were spending so much time ministering to people after their concerts that they just couldn't get to everyone. Ken saw a need, and God showed him how to address that void in a way that unlocked his journey as an author. And I love how even his experience as a drummer in a band wasn't wasted. When he was writing Vestal Goodman's book, she thought he couldn't relate to band life on the road, but he knew all too well. God has a way of making every experience from our lives connect to His purpose, and nothing is wasted when we give it to God. I appreciate Ken's advice about how to become a better interviewer. I kept that as part of this episode because I believe that we all need to improve our conversational skills. Asking open-ended questions and maintaining eye contact are very practical tips. I hope you took something away from that part of this conversation. I know I did. And he has some really good advice. People often advise authors to write about what they know, but Ken's advice went slightly a different direction on that. Write about what you don't know. Look for things that you don't know and research them. Always be learning. He keeps a stack of 13 thick books on his desk as a reminder. That's what he had to read just to be able to talk with Alberto Gonzalez to write his book. That's commitment to getting the heart on paper. One thing that I'm noticing across many of my Along the Way conversations is that God is looking for people who make themselves available to Him and His purposes. I try to make sure that I'm available to follow after God's direction and opportunities. When I was in Nashville to record these podcast episodes, I had 5 planned. I came home with 8. The additional 3 interviews were a huge blessing, and I can't wait to share them with you. But I would have missed God's opportunity if I didn't make sure that I was available and obedient to Him when the opportunity arose. In my conversation with Ken, he said that God brought him to Asbury College to prepare him for the rest of his life. That makes me wonder, what is God doing now, and where is God taking me now to prepare me for the rest of my life? I hope that you enjoyed my Along the Way conversation with Ken Abraham, and that you are pondering these questions too. As always, Ken's links and book recommendations are in the show notes. Thank you for listening to Along the Way. If you've enjoyed joining me along my way, please share this episode with a friend who you think would be encouraged by this podcast. Also, please rate and review this podcast on iTunes. It helps more people discover Along the Way. And subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and at my website, alongtheway.media. You can always email me at johnalongtheway@gmail.com. I hope you've enjoyed this part of my journey, and may you realize when Jesus is walking with you along your way.